Welcome to the Electric Monks podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Electric Monks podcast. I'm Ed and I'm here with my two co-hosts. Would you like to introduce yourself now, guys?
I'm Nemo, an Australian from planet Earth.
I'm Dalek from America and the owner of the r/Douglas Adams subreddit.
And I'm Ed. I'm just a amateur, recently graduated from university film editor. The Electric Monks podcast is devoted to everything related to Douglas Adams' holistic detective novels about the eponymous holistic detective Dirk Gently. But in order to understand everything that's Dirk Gently first, I thought it'd be a good idea to do an episode about the creator of Dirk Gently himself, Douglas Adams. And so I've named episode 1, Just Who Is That Hoopy Frood?
This is where we link to the Wikipedia page, obviously, and just go home.
Yeah, right.
Well done.
Right, yeah, where I just stole all of his information from that I've put in the script. But so how about ask a little bit of a personal question, guys? When did you first hear of Douglas Adams? For me, it was while I was at school, and when I sort of got a copy of, I think it was my dad who got me into it, and it was a copy of original Hitchhikers guys. It's the original one with the sort of weird multicolor sort of cover. I just remember really enjoying it and laughing a lot, and I also remember a little bit actually getting bullied at school slightly by one of the other kids. This was like junior school, so I was about 8 or 9, something like that. And I remember there was this other kid. I won't name him because I know he's still out there, and he basically made fun of me because he did. I think he didn't really like books with long words, long titles or something, and so he called it The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Poo-Poo or something like that. It was just like really immature. Yeah, me and him just didn't really see eye to eye on a lot of things. He really liked Michael Jackson, actually. That's what I remember about him, but yeah. What about you guys? You probably weren't bullied as much, I hope.
Well, I'll jump in. For me, it was not dissimilar. Well, my first Hitchhiker's memory of any form is not dissimilar in the sense that it was my father who was reading So Long and Thanks for All the Fish when that was brand new, and we're on a road trip somewhere, and I was 9 years old or something. I think that was about the right age for that book, and it's like, yo, what are you reading? What are you reading? I was like, oh yeah, this new book in this book series that I like. So I couldn't tell you when I first read it, or sometime between then at 9 and probably about through high school, I must have read it and enjoyed it, and at some point in university years, it was genuine fandom territory, and has been ever since.
Personally, I got into it around age 10 because I'd heard about the whole 42 joke for a very long time, and I looked up what that was from, and I was like, you know what, that looks kind of good, so I got myself a copy and read it.
Yeah, I think I definitely remember my dad actually reading the Hitchhikers books to me when I was quite young, about that sort of 7, 8, 9 or something like that. And I remember there's like they're not. I wouldn't say they're like specific. There's a specific age range you have to be to read the Hitchhikers books, especially. But Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But there's one of the, I forget which one. I think it's Life, the Universe, and Everything, which has the bit where Arthur Dent does something of a sexual nature. Let's put it that way. And I think Dad sort of skipped a whole chapter, or sort of glossed over it.
That's So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. That one is.
That one, yeah, sorry. It's been a while since I've read that. It's my brother who's read that.
That was more than one chapter.
Yeah. Well, you see, I wouldn't know because I never got to read that bit.
And then there's, of course, the Excentria Golumbits.
Oh, yes, the triple-breasted whore.
Yeah. The demographics of the universe, which was a joke purely set up for the Section 7, sex. None. Well, of course, there is lots.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought we'd start from the beginning with Douglas's life himself and a couple of interesting things that I sort of found out about him. So Douglas Noel Adams, aka DNA, that's often his sort of nickname that he got called online, especially in these sort of early days of the internet.
Nucleic acid.
So, oh yeah, of course, named after DNA, which was discovered by Crick and Watson in around about the same time, actually, which is interesting.
I believe Douglas actually joked that he was the first DNA from Cambridge.
Yeah.
Having predated the discovery by
a week or two,
months or years or weeks. I don't know the
I'm
details.
I'm pretty sure it was
the timeline.
Yeah, but he was born 11th of March 52 and 53, so it was a year. He was born a year before, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Week, basically the same thing.
Anyway, much. This isn't a DNA Crook and Watson podcast. This is a Douglas Adams podcast. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about what we know about Douglas's parents. So his mum was Janet, who was a nurse, and his dad was Christopher Adams, who was a theologian. And I think the other thing about the Adams family, oh dear, I don't want to make that joke. The thing about Doug Sam's predecessors, especially the male predecessors, they all had a tendency for being very tall, I think. Usually
very tall and having very large noses, yes.
Yes, exactly. And so
Adams
I think
was no exception.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so he was born in Cambridge, and that seems to be a sort of relevant because he went to to university at Cambridge as well, at St John's College. But there's a lot of his mum is sort of a kind of no nonsense kind of a person from what I've read about. But his dad tends not to, in a lot of Douglas Adams biographies, he tends not to come out particularly favourably because he was sort of a bit too reliant on the luxuries like cigars and stuff like that and expensive chairs and also he had this sort of weird streak because apparently when Douglas was quite young, Christopher Adams basically went to, I think, some island somewhere with a couple of university mates. And he went over to conduct a metaphysical experiment or something like that. And apparently he came back and he wrote this weird poem and he wasn't quite the same after that, sort of, for a while. And so he was initially born in Cambridge, and then after all this sort of went on, they moved to the East End in London, and things didn't end too well for Douglas's parents because when he was about 5, that's it. They divorced, and him and his younger sister. So he has this very strange family. Not strange, but sort of a fractured family tree because his dad went on to have a new family, ended up living with his maternal grandparents in an RSPCA animal shelter. So that's probably why Douglas developed sort of this fondness for animals, at least at sort of a fairly early age, which I think sort of it sort of appears in his work, especially in some of his later work, like Last Chance to See. He's definitely got very big on sort of different types of rare and exotic animals, some of which sadly no longer exist, of course. I read when I was on holiday, actually, that the Blue Macaw, which is if you've seen the film, the animated film, Rio, the kids film, that's the bird in that, is actually apparently gone extinct, at least in Brazil it has. So it sort of shows how important that work was for Douglas, the sort of Last Chance to See was.
He did consider it his most important and his favorite book, and it's there's a number of versions of Last Chance to See. There's the book, obviously, in the original radio series, and there was a CD-ROM that came out for PC and Mac that has lots of interesting information, including audio clips of the radio series, possibly the whole radio series. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. That's despite having original boxes of Last Chance to See of both PC and Mac versions, if I'm remembering my collection correctly. In case anybody's interested, the ISOs of those CDs are on archive.org. They're not too hard to find.
Ah, okay.
Definitely.
Everything's on archive.org.
That's true. That's why it's called archive.org.
There's lots of fantastic stuff on archive.org. Obviously, it's but yeah, it actually surprised me a little to find that it was on there, since it seemed like one of those things that would be under enough copyright that they wouldn't touch it. But it's there, and I wasn't going to complain. So
archive.org has Nintendo games. They don't get copyright struck.
That's true. That's true.
Where was I? So he lived with his maternal parents in RSPCA animal shelter, and then Douglas went to Primrose School in Brentwood, and he's already pretty tall. By the time he was 12, he was like 6'5", which is, even now, that's pretty insane. I think. I think there's always this tendency. I noticed.
He's been gone on record to say that on field trips and such, his teachers wouldn't say anything like "meet under the clock tower" or things like that. They'd say "meet under Adams."
Yeah, because
I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great anecdote. And another great anecdote is that his storywriting ability sort of became sort of well known and sort of recognized when he was quite an early age. He was the first and only student to be awarded 10 out of 10 for creative writing by his form master, a guy called Frank Howard, who was sort of friends with even after he left school, which is always, I don't know, I'm not sure if it's the case with you guys. I'm sort of friends with a few teachers, but I'm not like, I don't go out of my way to see them. But it's interesting how you sort of have this different, well, it's sort of the same relationship, but it's a little bit different after you leave school with people, especially ones you got on well with. The ones you didn't get on well with, you just tend to, hope you never see them again.
Definitely avoid some teachers. There's some that I wouldn't mind have keeping in touch with, but life, at that age, you're growing up, you're finding all sorts of new friends at university. And your first jobs and whatnots. Frank giving Douglas that 10 out of 10 obviously made a big impression on Douglas, as we'll mention in a moment, but it actually made an impression on Frank, and Frank remembered, in future years, he'd have classes that, kids would be like, "Oh, you never give us a 10," and he'd be like, "No, I did this one time."
Yeah, but that was Douglas Adams. You guys ain't Douglas Adams. Yeah.
And you never will be.
Yeah, but it was important. Like we say, it was important for Douglas as well because often in his career he suffered big, serious bouts of writer's block. He was often very behind on his deadline schedule.
Yeah, he often made fun of deadlines, though.
Yeah, yeah, the whooshing sound they make as they go rushing by. Yeah. And so this feedback from his old form master was just really important sort of motivation for him whenever he was at a sort of low ebb. He would look at it and think, "Yeah, I can still do this."
Yeah, he did about like an essay a year.
Yeah, and so we move on to his time at uni, and you're right, he did graduate in the end with an English BA honorary degree in English literature at St John's College, Cambridge, which is also sort of important to the whole what had been written in the Dirk Gently books as well, or the first one anyway. Like you're saying, Adams, in all those 3 years, he only did 3 essays, which is sort of unthinkable now. You get kicked out for doing that. But the main reason he wasn't doing as many essays as perhaps everyone else was because he was really interested in becoming a performer. He was a big fan of Monty Python, who, of course, getting fairly big at that time, so late 60s, early 70s. And he wanted to join this exclusive student comedy club, which is called Footlights, which is, I think, still going today. And he was initially the story goes that he was initially kind of turned down a bit, and then eventually they sort of relented and let him in because they realized he's pretty good. Initially, he started his own group. That was it. And then they let them in. And the group was Adamsverse Adams. And he was with 2 other guys. Another guy called Adams, with the surname Adams, but it wasn't related to him, and another guy called Smith. And so they performed for a while until they caught the attention of Monty Python themselves, which was sort of, I guess, kind of Douglas's aim.
Adams appeared in the Monty Python show for the first time on episode 42.
He did, yes.
This being before he coined that.
Yes, so him and Grant Stratton sort of built up this relationship which led to Douglas appearing in Monty Python, and he actually has a writing credit for a couple of sketches. There's one, I think there's the is it a musical sketch which appears on the is it the Life of Brian album or the Holy Grail?
It's Holy
one
Grail.
about Marilyn. Yeah, Holy Grail. It's the one about Marilyn Monroe. I think I can't remember it off by heart. But,
Yep. The sketch is about Marilyn being recast in movies, and you got the interviewer talking about, but she's dead, and it's like, no, but she's in every shot. And then it's like, but surely she was cremated. Oh well, we had a body stand in, and yeah, it was.
Yeah, it just gets more and more ridiculous.
The album of the soundtrack of the trailer of Monty Python and the Holy Grail is from
That's it.
the full title. I've got that. I'm a Monty Python collector and fan. Before I was a Douglas Adams collector and fan, in fact. So I've got a horribly.
I guess you share that with
complete
Douglas himself. Because he
Yes.
was a fan who got to sort of be part of it, which is pretty amazing. But so there was this sort of brief writing partnership with Graham Chapman. There wasn't just Monty Python. There was, I think, this. Was it George Harrison?
Out of the Trees.
Out of the
yes,
Trees. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Out of the Trees was also, but no, you're right. I was forgetting the George Harrison. No, it was Ringo Starr. It was the Ringo Starr show.
Ringo, sorry, yes, I get the Beatles mixed up as well.
George Harrison partially funded Life of Brian, or wholly funded, or something. Yeah, so
that
there
was
is
it. Yeah, so he was Handmade Films. That was George Harrison.
That's the one, Handmade.
The ones who also did With Noel and I later on.
I didn't know that one.
Oh, that's okay. It's good for. We'll tell you about With Noel. We'll make a With Noel and I podcast some other time. But anyway. And so he appeared. So Douglas appeared in 2 episodes of the Monty Python sketch show, which was episode 42, where he played this. He appears as a surgeon, in a sketch where Michael Palin's narrating, and he introduces one person after another, but the sketch never gets going. It's always sort of, I think, and this is Doctor Smith, who's. He knows the cure to cancer or something, but then the story becomes about someone else, and nothing actually. There's the plot. No, it doesn't actually settle on a plot. And then he appears in another one, which I've not seen, where he appears in drag as the sort of iconic Monty Python pepper pot, I think they're called.
Yeah.
And he loads a missile into a scrap cart driven by Terry Jones in a sort of weird kind of sci-fi sketch, which is interesting. It's interesting that sort of he tried to drive Monty Python a little bit in that sort of sci-fi direction. And the partnership ended because Douglas was, I think he was originally supposed to, he ended up, I think he was trying to help Chapman write his memoirs or his autobiography or something. And Chapman just procrastinated a lot and went down drinking, and they sort of weren't getting anything done. And he decided Douglas really wanted to make it on his own as a solo writer. And he felt that his own style of comedy wasn't really suited to what was going on already during the 70s. I think he liked the Python stuff, but he wanted to do something a bit different as well. And so he sort of parted ways with Chapman, and he had a few wilderness years where he did sort of odd jobs. And this is sort of where his height helped out a little bit, because he worked as a bodyguard, I think, for an Arab, some high-ranking Arab official or prince or something. I forget who it was. It doesn't matter. But he didn't really have any experience as a bodyguard or like using a gun or anything. They just got him because he was tall, and so he would just follow him around or stand outside the building that they were like a restaurant they were eating dinner in, and then anyone who would like possibly want to hurt them would see this massive tall Douglas Adams and just sort of back away. That was the logic behind that. He was so tall and imposing that he could just scare everyone off. And he didn't say a lot. A lot of it, I think, a lot of his recollection of that was sort of just observing and not having to do very much, and then getting paid at the end of the week or something. We didn't get to what we were talking about the start of the podcast, which was his magnum opus, I guess. He did this pitch with Simon Brett to BBC Radio 4 for Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy, and it was sort of, I think the story is that he pitched it to someone in like a sushi restaurant in 1977, and they said, "Wow, that sounds great." And it was sort of this really pivotal moment for Douglas, because it could have, because he was thinking it could have gone that if this didn't work, then he doesn't know what he's going to do, and it did, and eventually got made. The first series was launched in March '78, and despite being broadcast at like 10:30 on a Tuesday evening, it somehow managed to achieve like this great success. I don't think it was an overnight success. I don't think it's fair to say that, because Douglas obviously worked on it for a long while. It's interesting, even in '77, I've read the original pitch of it, and Arthur has a completely different name, and the plot of it is very, very different in terms of, well, the bare bones are there of Earth getting destroyed and in the pilot and things like that, and Ford is
if
still
I remember, if I remember, wasn't the original the ends of the Earth, that it was going to be each episode would end with the Earth being destroyed in a different way, and this Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy would be the common element of all of these, I guess, alternate universe stories that.
Yeah, it was sort of this non-serialized thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I always thought that was interesting that in essence he had this idea for multiple Earth endings, and what we got instead was the first idea of that turned into this multi-part radio series, and then books and computer game and towel and TV series movie. And of course then the last book, it kind of came circled around back to that idea that multiple universes and the Earth was destroyed in all of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Albeit the original idea, I imagine, would have been completely different methods each time, and we never did get that. So I feel like there must be some interesting ideas that maybe got written down somewhere that might surface one day.
Yeah, in fact, there's the book that I was reading, which is the Frood, the authorized and very official history of Douglas Adams and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Jem Roberts.
That's the one that I haven't read yet.
Yeah, it has a lot of the. It was done. I think it's a book that was released in 2014, so it has a lot of the stuff from Douglas's sort of archives that are being kept. I think at St. John's actually, and one of them is the original picture. I got it in front of me, and there's a lot. I won't read all of it, but a couple of interesting things. It's the same thing that Ford is essentially a researcher for Hitchhiker's Guide. But interesting thing is, when he first arrived, the minimal research he'd done suggested to him that the name Ford Prefect would be nicely inconspicuous. On discovering his error, he later changed this to Ford L Prefect in an attempt to repair the damage. And then instead of Arthur, it's Alaric B. That was his original name.
I've heard that before, yeah. Alaric B. But Ford L Prefect, that's new headcanon for me. I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, their adventures are set against a universe torn asunder by the frightful struggle between Mrs. Rogers, a giant megacomputer who behaves and talks like a cross between the Queen and Margaret Thatcher, and adopts a rather Jewish motherly attitude towards the universe, which he sees as being her charge, and the naughty one, who's a freak of nature, as fantastically intelligent but rather greasy Chinese meal, which sits in state on a grubby red and white checkered tablecloth on its own artificial asteroid, from which it generates most of the malevolent influences in the universe. So that's the basic outline. Mrs. Rogers sounds a lot like Deep Thought to me, but there are a few other things about the original pitch, like the original one has Alaric being taken by Ford into a shed instead of down the pub, which I find quite funny. Doing order while his house is being destroyed. But yeah, so it was this great success, and the second series followed in 1980. And in between that, Douglas wrote Hitchhikers into novel form in 79. And the radio series became the basis of a 6-part BBC television miniseries with some of the same actors in it. Simon Jones as Arthur. They had a different actor for Ford and a couple others in there as well. Trillian had a different actress. Mark McDavie also played Zaphod, I think. So yeah, half of them were about the same.
Yeah.
But anyway, that was broadcast in 1981. Sadly, didn't receive a follow-up. I think that was originally, but there was a sort of trouble production on it. So there's this interesting story about this convention he went to in, I think, either 78 or 79, just after the first series of Hitchhikers became this smash hit. It was taking place in the UK, or something similar to Comic-Con. This is around the same time as the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, and there was a poll about which was better, Hitchhikers or Superman. Well, I think there was lots of other sci-fi properties as well, and Superman just beat Hitchhikers, and I think Douglas was a little bit annoyed about it, but Christopher Reeve they were like booed on stage because they wanted Hitchhikers to win. The audience.
I think might have been a Hugo Award even, that Superman won and beat out Hitchhikers. I
might have been, yeah.
But yeah, I don't think it was just a local poll. It was quite an official thing in that regard.
I remember reading about it in Jem Roberts' book, and I thought that was just this hilarious anecdote of sort of how to have regionally popular. Obviously, in America, it would be Christopher Reeve Superman would win hands down because no one had really heard of Hitchhikers back then, obviously, because it hadn't been syndicated yet.
So it was Douglas Adams was the. I'm literally just reading from Wikipedia here, so that's why it's so well written. Douglas Adams was guest of honour at the 1979 World Science Fiction Convention, CCon, held in Brighton, England. it was there that the radio series was nominated for a Hugo Award, it being the first radio series to receive that nomination, but lost to Superman.
That was it. Yeah, that sounds about right, to be honest. There's definitely this convention because there is other stories from that of Douglas alluding to the fact that he had basically slept with a few women during these as a result of his fame and stuff like that. So he was hugely popular back then. But anyway, it wasn't just Hitchhikers that Douglas is sort of fairly well known and respected, but he also had a stint on the long-running British sci-fi program Doctor Who, which is obviously still running today. It just started its 11th series with Jodie Whittaker in the lead role. But back then it was Tom Baker. Douglas was made a BBC radio producer, and they initially had him sitcoms and soaps and stuff like that. And he really wasn't keen on that. He really wanted to do like wacky adventures and sci-fi stuff. So he ended up on getting this offer to work on Doctor Who, and he was the script editor for the 17th season. But that's actually a bigger role than I make it sound like, because as a script editor, he was there are a lot of plots where he was given the bare bones, and he basically had to write out all the dialogue and stuff for the 17th season. And he was doing that on top of Hitchhikers as well. So general consensus is the 17th series, sort of patchy with a couple of great stories, I think. And he's officially credited sort of as writing 2 stories, but he did write another one sort of on his own. So the 3 serials that he did were The Pirate Planet, City of Death, which he co-wrote with producer Graham Williams. City of Death, I think he did under a pseudonym.
Well, the pseudonym was due to BBC rules at the time. Basically, that because he was script editor, there was a limit to how many episodes he could write, because his job wasn't to be a writer. The idea of Pirate Planet actually came from the whoever the writer originally was that was brought in to do it, and then so the idea was somebody else, and then they I think personal issues in their life meant that they weren't able to follow through, and Graham and Douglas finished it off, and I believe that was largely Graham going, Douglas, here's a room, I'm going to feed you coffee.
Yeah, that's a running theme with Douglas trying to get work done. They just put him in a room, and it feels borderline like a kidnap situation. Where it's just like, we won't let you go until you've finished the novel or the TV script or whatever. And there was another serial, of course, which is in the infamous Sharda. So the interesting thing about City of Death is that ITV basically had a strike at that time, which took it off the air. And so, because obviously there were only 3 technically TV channels, because you had BBC One and BBC Two and ITV, and with their main competition basically out, City of Death attracted the largest ever TV audience for a single episode. So a little bit of good fortune there, but obviously it was good enough for people to keep watching, not just switch off entirely. It
is, and it holds up quite well today as a story too. So it's not like it got that purely through serendipity. I've had a number of friends through the years, Doctor Who friends, who, when other people have asked, like, oh, what of classic series should I watch? And it's not uncommon that the recommendation of watch City of Death. It's it has the right mix of sci-fi and adventure, and scary bits and comedy, and it holds together well. If anything, the pacing is a little bit off because there are so many scenes of people running down Parisian streets, and that does slow it down a little bit.
Yeah, they do show off a lot.
You can't blame them.
Film in Paris, yeah.
Yeah, it was the first time that Doctor Who had been filmed overseas, so and you can't blame him.
You can tell looking at, like, I've seen clips of it, and you can tell Paris and like on the subway and stuff. You can tell people in the background just sort of like they don't know, they're not like extras or anything. They just genuinely think, what's this weird? What's Tom Baker doing in this getup? What's going on? But I think the boot was on the other foot a bit later in at the end of season 17 with Sharda, because production, they've got about halfway through production, and then they shot most of the exteriors and stuff, but the interiors they were only partway kind of through. And production of the episode just stopped completely because of union strikes that happened at the time in the BBC. It was sort of related to something completely different. I forget exactly what. It was very complicated and political. It's sort of usually about pay, I think. But that sort of stopped the whole thing in its tracks. I think the BBC released a sort of definitive kind of animated cut where they sort of animated all the missing segments and stuff. This year, actually, it was on BBC America in the US. so Dalek might have seen it, but
they released a version that had Tom Baker just narrating summaries of the missing bits.
yeah, was that the 92 version? Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably about the era. There's been at least one, but possibly a couple of fan versions that have animated the sequences in between. I think Ian Levine's version is probably the most famous because he actually got some of the original actors back to read their parts from the original script. And then, yeah, the most recent official BBC version, which largely the same. They got the original actors back as much as possible. And and it was adapted as an Eighth Doctor audio
Big Finish
play as well. Big Finish, yeah. So that was done, and there was a
with Paul McGann
flash animation on top of that. So yeah, and that was largely the original script with kind of a wrapper at the start where the Eighth Doctor shows up. Romana's president of Gallifrey, Eighth Doctor shows up and says, "There was that thing that we forgot to do that time. Let's go do it." And, it explains why the Eighth Doctor is suddenly running around with Romana and this 1970s story. Which was kind of cute as well. So it's an interesting position in the Doctor Who lack of canon in that regard.
The last thing about Doctor Who is that before Douglas became the script editor in the mid-70s, sort of when Sarah Jane was the Doctor's companion, he wanted to do a potential feature film for Doctor Who, which has also never been sort of done. And it would have been called Doctor Who and the Cricket Men, which was essentially, it was sort of reworked into the third Hitchhikers, but Life, Universe and everything. And that was adapted into a third radio series of Hitchhikers. It's pretty much intact apart from the fact that the Doctor and Sarah Jane obviously aren't in the third series. They've substituted Hitchhikers characters, and the only problem is that the Hitchhikers don't have a huge motivation to get involved in the narrative. He sort of had to invent one, and that was one of his big criticisms of the book. Is right, Ned?
Yeah. Well, I recall Douglas at one point, and I don't know where I read this, and I haven't tracked it down since, so I may be wrong, but I recall hearing somewhere at some point that he basically wrote Ford as an anti-Doctor. The Doctor's this character who knows everything and has a solution for everything, and there isn't really any plot. There's never shown any difficult learning process. The Doctor just shows up and has the answers, and that's great for the type of story Doctor Who is, but it means that the Doctor's always doing that and wants to solve the problems. And Ford was written as this character that he's got the answers, he's got the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but he'd rather go down to the pub and have a drink, or he'd rather go up to the party. And it's made clear in that novel, in Life, Universe and everything, that Ford specifically responds to Slightly Barfast and says, the universe is old and ugly enough to look after itself. I want to go get a drink.
Yeah.
I want to go to a party, whatever. However it was, the exact wording eludes me, but as a contrast to the Doctor, it's almost a forgotten contrast, but it's an interesting take on the character that I always like to remember. That I love both characters. I'm a big fan of Doctor Who and big fan of Monty Python. Sorry, I'm a big fan of Hitchhikers, but the contrast between those two characters is very interesting, I find.
So the main thing this podcast is actually about is what Douglas does next, which is Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agent. So after the fourth book, Douglas was starting to become a bit burnt out, and these sort of, I get the sense he's sort of starting to resent Hitchhikers a little bit from the fact that there's this constant pressure to write more books from fans, and
that was what he was famous for. And the first book, the first Hitchhikers, got published because the publisher was like, finish the chapter you're on. We're going to send us the manuscript and we'll get it published. And then he wrote the second. He was on a roll and he wrote the second at the same time as he was writing the second radio series. So it was just this Hitchhiker generating thing, and the second book was written to be the final one of the series. That was it. Radio series is done. The books are done. It didn't seem to be written with an eye to the future, and then they wanted more, so he dug up the old Doctor Who and the Cricketman script and turned that into the third book, and they wanted more. And so he wrote this brand new script with Fenchurch, and they wanted more. And yeah, at that point he was a bit sick of it and said, well, I want to do something else. And I have this idea.
Yeah, I think So Long and Thanks for All the Fish was particularly difficult to write. That was the one where they locked him in the hotel and basically wouldn't let him do anything until he finished. Well, he'd let him eat, I think, and go to the toilet. Apart from that, they wouldn't let him sleep, definitely. Another thing that happened, Douglas obviously became quite wealthy off the back of Hitchhikers, and he bought a place in, I think, New York. He bought this apartment, a stylish apartment. But what happened was his accountant who cooked the books, he basically got in trouble, in deep trouble for fraud, and Douglas went from having a lot of money to basically suddenly being in debt and having to, work again for a living, like he was when he first wrote Hitchhikers, I guess. And then, of course, it took another twist when his accountant basically, unfortunately, committed suicide. So, so that's the sort of mindset he was in. He was suddenly he suddenly had to do this to sort of stuff it, rather than just because fans wanted him to. It wasn't a luxury anymore. I think So Long Thanks to All the Fish was finished in 84 or 85, and then in 86 he signed this one of the biggest. He signed this huge deal, $2.2 million with Simon & Schuster in America. Although in the UK the publishing rights were sold for like £575,000, which is still a lot, but nowhere near as much. Yeah, it was one of the biggest publishing deals in history, apparently, for these books, and no one knew what they were going to be.
That's impressive.
Yeah, so that was literally on his name, and like I said, and Douglas sort of agreed that he would have his first book ready for Christmas for publication in spring of 1987. And when the Xmas deadline arrived, of course, Douglas, he didn't really have what they expected. He had no title, and what was originally going to be the first sentence of the book, which is still in there. It's high on a rocky promontory sat an electric monk on a bored horse, and then that's it. Well, come back for the rest later. And his agent a little bit pissed off about that. And so
it is a very good line.
It is. It's a great line. It's actually not the first. I always remember it as being the first one, and I think but actually the first line is this time there'll be no witnesses, which is a little bit more sinister.
Yeah.
The more mysterious, kind of ominous prologue. But
well, when you were just saying that it's still in there, but it's no longer the first line. The first thing
it's beginning of the second chapter.
Wait, that's near the start. Yeah, my first reaction was like that, but it's not the first line. No, but yeah, it's the first memorable line. But yeah, you're right. There is that. It's almost a prologue to the real story.
Yeah, and in order to get the thing finished on time, Douglas basically, because I think it's the only book that Douglas ever sort of couldn't meet the deadline for was actually the sequel, which was Long Dark Tea Time. But Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, Douglas basically, he reused the character from Sharda, which was the one that was never broadcast. That was Professor Chronotis, where he called him Professor Reg Chronotis. They just call him Regin.
Yeah.
And he reused a very sort of similar plot from City of Death for the book's main villain, and that's villain maybe is a strong. Well, he does want to wipe out. He's basically his aim, coincidentally, and threatens to basically wipe out humanity or make sure it was never existed in the first place. So he's kind of antagonist at the very least.
And antagonist is a good word.
Yeah, we'll cover that more when we cover the book at some point, I guess, but in more detail. But so Dirk Gently is sort of protagonist. He doesn't turn up until 13 chapters in, and I thought it was interesting in the more recent TV show from 2016. He doesn't show up until 13 minutes into the first episode of that, which I thought was a nice little nod. But I'm not sure if anyone knows. But it's probably coincidental. Yeah.
I always did find with Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, the novel, that Dirk himself almost felt like a secondary character. Which makes sense given its origins as Sharda, as a hybrid of Sharda and City of Death. But yeah, it's. I remember when I read the second novel that I couldn't connect to any of the characters. Like, but but all of my favorite characters from Dirk Gently's aren't here. The only one that's still here is Dirk Gently, and he didn't feel like a central character in the first book, in a way. Part of the reason I couldn't connect to Dirk was that maybe that because he didn't show up quite so early in the book compared to the other main characters in the book, Reg Cronotis and
Richard Macduff.
Richard Macduff, yes. And Macduff was my favorite. He was like, I want to see more Macduff in the second book, and he wasn't there. And
that's interesting.
When I read it,
Macduff is sort of based in Jim Roberts' book. He points this out quite clearly that Macduff is sort of has a lot of similar traits to Douglas himself, and he might sort of be Douglas's view of himself. So he's a computer programmer, he's a Cambridge graduate, and he's a sort of hopeless boyfriend as well, because Douglas had a lot of tumultuous relationships that didn't end very well, and I think maybe this is his sort of little bit. He's still a very likable character, but there's a sort of feeling that he's a little bit of sort of a loser, and maybe that's Douglas's own commentary. And Dirk himself is based a bit more on Michael Bywater, who was his friend at the time. He was co-writer on a lot of video games. There was obviously there were sort of text adventures essentially. There was one for Hitchhikers, I think, and a similar one called
Bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy. Yeah, was that the one where?
Yeah.
He.
I didn't think Bywater was involved with Bureaucracy, but
okay.
He was definitely involved with Hitchhikers.
Later, he was involved in Starship Titanic as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not sure if he was involved with either of the Hitchhikers. He was definitely involved in Starship Titanic, and that's also where they had a falling out, because Bywater was originally meant to write the novel of Starship Titanic, and through whatever miscommunication or something that ended up not
I think they were worried
that
it would take too long. Ironically, Douglas was worried that Michael Bywater would take too long, so he got Terry Jones to do it instead.
Yeah, and then Bywater took offence at that, and the fallout ended the friendship by and large.
It's a shame that they never really reconciled before Douglas passed away, unfortunately. But Michael Bywater still has that sort of place, and there's footage from a TV program that was sort of celebrating Douglas's achievements in the early 90s called the South Bank Show, where Michael Bywater actually played Dirk Gently. I've not seen the full thing. I've seen some clips from it.
I'm pretty sure it's on YouTube. It's really cool for that. At the time it was the only Dirk Gently on TV in any form, but
and Michael Bywater does a really good job of being like definitely accurate to the book, which is fairly easy because it was sort of inspired by him.
Yeah, for sure. It certainly makes sense that Richard Macduff was Douglas's view of himself, and there's what springs to mind for that is that in the book, Richard Macduff writes a non-trivial computer program, the couch simulation, to solve a problem almost as a distraction from doing real work. And in Last Chance to See, Douglas wrote a hyperbook stack, a program on old Macintosh systems to calculate the volume of a kakapo's nest, if I'm remembering right. Because that was very much the impression I got from Last Chance to See was that he wrote this because he could on the computer, and it gave him a distraction from doing real work, which in that case would have been writing Last Chance to See.
I remember reading something about one of the papers that Duff publishes is sort of pretty similar, or maybe word for word. It's the same title as one of Douglas's own ones from his earlier days.
Oh, that's cool.
Okay, so that was the first book, and in '88, Adams released a follow-up novel a little bit late. It was the only one of his books that was sort of where he couldn't meet the deadline on time, and this was Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul, and it's a completely new adventure, and Dirk, like you say, Dirk is the only kind of returning character. I'm sort of in the middle. I think I must have read it around the same time as I read the original, which was around, I think, 2010, around about the time of the BBC4 TV show, which is obviously a slightly bigger deal here than anywhere else. And that was what got me to read the original books again. And I definitely remember the first book, but the second book I don't remember much of it all as I'm going back through it. So I can't remember exactly what happened. There's something with 4 and something with a fridge. I remember the fridge. That's it. Yeah. But
the important bit is the feud between Dirk and the cleaner.
yeah, yeah, that is pretty awesome, and that's something that they sort of carried into the BBC Four show. I think the final episode is sort of Dirk versus the cleaner, and
I should rewatch the BBC that version because I have it's been years since I've read the novels, but I have a fairly decent I feel like I've got a fairly reasonable recollection of the plot of the novels, but I've only seen the TV series through the once.
yeah, well, I'll talk about it a little bit later, but it is
that element
a little different. 92. Obviously, there's Last Chance to See sort of going on around about the same time as this. Meaning of Life as well, which is a little book he wrote with someone else. I forget who it was. John Lloyd, that's it. John Lloyd, the guy who pitched Hitchhikers with initially.
Pitched Hitchhikers with John Lloyd, so co-wrote the last episode of the first series.
In 92, Douglas wrote Mostly Harmless, which is the last Hitchhiker book that he would write. Last one that he would finish anyway. And originally it was going to be the last one. But Douglas sort of admitted it was a bit dark. He wrote it during a really bad time, even though he got married during that year, actually. But he still said it was a miserable time for him. So I don't think we should read too much into that. Maybe there was something else going on. But it was another lock him in the hotel until he finishes it kind of scenario, from what I understand.
Given his dislike of writing, getting married may have been a distraction, and being taken away from a brand new marriage to have to write a book may have been part of what made it a bad year. What I point out is that the style of Mostly Harmless is really vastly different from the first four novels, and
that was noticed at the time, I think, by reviewers.
And that said, I mean, the first two novels are very much the same style, and then the third is a different style because it's a reworked Doctor Who script, and then the fourth is a different style because it's effectively a love story, then the fifth is a different style because it's written from a dark place that he really just wanted to kill everybody off in every possible dimension and through all of time and space and probability, and deliberately make it impossible to bring the series back. But part of the way that was done that I find is that the complexity of the plot. There's a really big leap between the first two Hitchhikers. The plot is I'm making up as I go along. The third was a Doctor Who story, so it had to follow the path. He couldn't just take a tangent and then that turns into the plot. The fourth was still a fairly straightforward story, but the fifth is this really convoluted plot. And so I recommend to people that they read the two Dirk Gently novels between the fourth and the fifth Hitchhikers, because the two Dirk Gently novels bridge that plot gap, as it were. The first Dirk Gently novel has a more complex plot than the fourth Hitchhikers. And then the second Dirk Gently is more complex again. And so then when you get back to Hitchhikers for book number 5, you've had that progression of style, and you don't get this jarring jump between Hitchhikers 4 and Hitchhikers 5.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's that evolution, because I always saw them as sort of a separate franchise, and I thought the fact that he went back to write another Hitchhikers book was sort of interesting. That maybe he kind of needed that break to sort of refresh himself, even though he sort of didn't really want to. I thought there was part of him that I don't think really wanted to come back, and when he did,
he didn't. I think Mostly Harmless was very much written from all right, I'm doing this because there's just so much demand to do it, and that's why it was ended the way that it did, was an attempt to make it impossible for the fans to harass him into doing a sixth. And it was years later when he said, once he'd gotten over that angst, effectively, where he said, well, actually, I'm over that now. I'm okay with doing a sixth. And you know what? Even though I wrote them out of all possible time, space, and eternity in the fifth, that means they're all in the same place, and that makes it a lot easier to do a sixth. I've got an idea.
Indeed.
Unfortunately.
But there are a few things that happened before 2001 that I think are worth mentioning. In the mid-90s, there was a play of Dirk Gently, and the reason this came about was because there was a student called Arvin D. van David at Cambridge who adapted, who sort of read Douglas's Dirk Gently books. He was a big fan of Hitchhikers first, and when Dirk Gently came out, he wanted to adapt it to a stage play at school and then later at university. And obviously, in order to do it at Cambridge, you need the rights. So you end up writing to Douglas's agent, Ed Victor. And the response you got, because obviously you need the rights to do it, was sort of, oh, you can give it a go, but we think Dirk Gently is unadaptable. So give it your best shot, kid. And he did. And he had to cut out, I think, memorably, the Electric Monk had to be cut out, but there's still pretty much most of the book is intact. It definitely captures the spirit of the first book, from what I've heard. It still plays from time to time in certain parts of the UK, although it's sort of a little bit underground.
It was performed in Brisbane a few years back, and I got to see it.
Oh, okay. I've never actually met someone who's seen it.
It's a local amateur theatre troupe put it on at a local production of it. I could dig up the details, but it's not that interesting, to be honest. But the production itself, the result of it, it was quite well done. I got to the end of it and felt like that. Certainly there were bits of the story that were completely cut out. As you say, the Electric Monk. There were parts of the story that were adapted quite cleverly. The Dirk's hypnosis of Macduff, where
it's the aunt from Winnipeg that they changed, isn't it?
Yeah. So instead of jumping into the canal, he sings a song and does a dance or something. I don't remember the details, I must admit, but there were bits like that seemed like straightforward adaptations, and there were bits that my recollection of what I thought of it at the time was that it was very cleverly adapted, and I definitely enjoyed it and would see again.
And the reason I mention Arvind is because he becomes a key player a bit later on, when especially first it was the Dirk Gently comics, which he basically got the rights to because of his good relationship with Douglas's agent, Ed Victor. And then after the comics, just immediate after comics, there was the 2016 series, the Max Landis BBC America one. And he was involved in that as a producer, and he wrote sort of comics concurrently with that sort of explained little things that were going on and sort of tied, because there's a sort of, I'll talk about it a bit later, but there's a sort of weird relationship between the TV show and the books in that they were sort of marketed, the TV show is marketed as a continuation of the books, but it's actually an alternate sort of universe, and the comics explain that really well.
Yeah, I've got the comics, but I haven't read them yet.
Okay.
I had got the impression that they were made concurrently. I didn't realize that the comics had been kickstarted before the. I shouldn't say kickstarted because that's the future of the comics, but we'll get into that later. But yeah, the exact time frame of when the comics were organized and then written and then published versus the TV series organized and then written and then filmed and then broadcast, I'm not completely clear on, but certainly close enough that I kind of think of them all as the comics and the 2016 TV series all came out, and lots of people have seen the TV series and been sad that it didn't get a third season, and not enough people have seen the comics.
Exactly.
And I said that as one that, as I say, who hasn't yet read them, but I've read about them.
Yeah. Anyway, we can talk about them a bit later. I've read them. I've read the last series. Our story arc of comics that he did, which was named Sam and Adele, which is also the name of the final book of Douglas that was published, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I think it's very good. Anyway, I want to talk about Digital Village, which was later renamed to H2G2, which Douglas founded in '96, and that was sort of his big multimedia thing. But what did Digital Village actually do? There's Starship Titanic, which we mentioned earlier, which is essentially sort of puzzle sort of story game about the Titanic crashes into a spaceship Titanic, sort of Starship Titanic rather, from it's sort of mentioned in passing in the Hitchhikers books.
Yeah, it's a 2-sentence joke as part of the explanation of the Starship Heart of Gold, because the Starship Heart of Gold was powered by the infinite improbability drive, and the Starship Titanic was powered by an earlier version and suffered a total existence failure.
Yeah.
But it turns out in the game that that didn't happen. What instead happened was that it crashed into your house, and so naturally, when a spaceship crashes into your house, you go into the spaceship, and then it takes off again, and thus the game begins.
Yeah, it's not perfect by any means, but it's definitely entertaining. It's definitely a good idea.
it's definitely imaginative. It's
been a while
one of
since
the
I
things
played
they
it.
wanted to do- yeah, one of the things they wanted to do, or that Douglas wanted to do with that game, was to bring back the puzzle solvingness of the original text adventure game.
Yeah, he was
feeling,
very
where you felt
influenced by Myst, wasn't he?
that,
I remember
graphically,
reading,
it was.
yeah.
What was the sequel to Myst? Was called.
Yeah.
And this is relevant for the next thing I was going to say, but
Oh, it wasn't
there was a
yes,
sequel to Myst.
is it? No,
Yeah,
that's something else.
Myst. Myst. Interesting. Just to do the interconnectedness of all things.
Myst 2 Riven?
Myst was
That was about the same time,
Riven.
wasn't it? Yeah.
Riven. Yes. Yeah. So Myst was originally written as a hypercard stack.
Ah, okay.
And then developed from there. And I'm not sure quite what path from being a hypercard stack to full published professional game that was available on systems that didn't have hypercard, because hypercard was very much a Macintosh only thing, classic era Macintosh. But yeah, Myst was got a lot of fame for being very pretty, but not actually very difficult. At the time, there was almost sneeringly from computer gamers this idea that with Myst you just sit and you click the screen enough times and eventually you'll finish the game. It's just
a lot of it was the
game.
atmosphere. That's what a lot of people remember about
Myst.
It was
the atmosphere and
the music.
that style of the game is what was famous. And then Riven being the sequel to Myst, and that came out around the same time as Starship Titanic. And of course, because Myst was so famous, the advertising for Riven was Riven, your sequel to Myst. With Starship Titanic, part of their advertising was not a sequel to anything, and it was deliberately a callback to to contrast it to Riven as the Myst sequel. They were saying, we're a different game. We're not a sequel to anything, which because it was tangenting from the Hitchhikers universe, is stretching the truth. It's not that it was stretching the truth, because it was its own game. It wasn't a sequel game to anything, but it was leveraging from an existing franchise.
A little bit, but he did that with Dirk as well before. He's very good at recycling his other stuff, the good bits anyway. And the other thing I wanted to say is that Starship Titanic didn't do very well. It sort of suffered commercially, didn't sell very well. And Douglas's explanation was it wasn't a violent game, and violent games are in at the moment. So it was something like that.
There's maybe a half truth to that, but
maybe, yeah.
I don't think it's the only thing. The biggest criticisms I remember of the game at the time, because I bought it new. I've got an A0 size cardboard advertising of Starship Titanic in my bedroom.
Ooh.
That's the sort of collector I am. Is that I got a chance of collecting that, and I'm like, oh, absolutely, and I've kept it ever since. But the biggest criticism of Starship Titanic at the time was that you spent a lot of time moving from place to place. The puzzles were good, but there was no shortcut mechanism. That if you had to do the first half of the puzzle at the front of the ship and the second half of the puzzle at the back of the ship, and then you had to go to the bottom of the ship to for that final piece, you'd spend a lot of time traveling, and it broke the flow of the puzzle solving. And that would be especially relevant if the thing that you had to do in the second half of the puzzle was affected by the thing that you did in the first half of the puzzle. And so if you didn't do it, the next time you'd do the first half of the puzzle again a different way, and then you'd spend the time traveling to the other end of the ship, and then you could do the second half of the puzzle and see if it was even worth the time. And that frustration, I think, was the biggest criticism that I heard about the game at the time. That said, I never finished the game either. So
okay. Apparently, Douglas does appear at the very end of the game in a sort of a.
He also appears at the very start of the game.
He does. Yeah. Oh, we go. That's how long as. It was like 5 when I played it, I think, and I didn't get very far.
The game starts quite self-referentially. That on screen, what appears is you sitting at a computer in your house, and you start the game by in the game picking up the Starship Titanic CD and putting it in the computer on screen, and if instead of doing that, you turn around and watch the TV, what appears on the TV is Douglas Adams saying, "Get on with it,
Yeah,
play the
that's it.
game." And as soon as you put the CD in the computer within the game, then the ship crashes into your house and destroys the TV and the computer, and the bottom of the ship opens up, and a genuine people personality opens up and says, "Come with me. I need your help."
That's it.
Or,
Yeah. I definitely remember that beginning of the thing crashing in. Come with me if you want to live. Well, wait, that's Terminator, but it's Carl Reese.
It's the Douglas Adams version of that sentiment.
Yeah. The other thing that HDD2 is remembered for, and still does actually, it's still running, is their website, which is just called Hitchhiker's Guide to Earth, and it's a real life encyclopedia version of Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy with it's sort of an encyclopedia with funny anecdotes, essentially. And the website itself is a bit long in the tooth. It used to be hosted on the BBC, but now they have their own website. It's definitely worth checking out, I think, even if only to look at the comments by DNA, which is Douglas himself, made in, I think, 2000 when it was just set up. And he's asked about all sorts of things as well. I think one of the things Douglas really liked about it was the sort of people didn't know who DNA was at first, so he had that kind of anonymity, and people would like talk about him in forums and stuff, and he would like be able to pitch in his sort of opinion anonymously and sort of say, "I think this might have been what he was trying to say," or something like that. But it wasn't mainly to comment on his own work; it was to comment on stuff completely different, and he liked not being recognised, I think. And of course, we come to go on.
I was just going to say, Douglas did hang out on or post a few times historically on the news group Old Fan Douglas Adams, and unfortunately, he was driven away by various people that didn't believe that was genuinely Douglas Adams posting on the Douglas Adams fan forum, and were asking him to prove himself and not believing because he at the time he was in the US and had a US email address, stuff like that. It's really
some things never changed.
Really disappointing.
Yeah.
I got curious one day and tried to track down these posts of disbelieving Douglas, and I could only find one, and it was by one person who many years later is still on news groups in the Doctor Who forums and is still obnoxious. So yes, some things never change.
Yeah. So we come to the end of Douglas's story, unfortunately, which was, I'm sure everyone knows, it's sort of, he was in a private gym in Montecito, California, and so he's moved, like you say, he's moved to the US at this point with his family, and sort of the focus has moved to the Hitchhikers movie that he was sort of helping write for, and sort of going through all sorts of different scripts and collaborators on that, and he had a heart attack and he passed away at 49. While before Douglas passed away, he was working on a third Dirk Gently novel. This is something I found interesting. I read Salmon of Doubt, which is what it was published as posthumously the following year, but it's sort of the half-finished story with some notes. And the reason he didn't finish it was because he felt that it would have fitted Hitchhikers a little better. And there's also a couple of other little bonus stories, like one about young Zaphod plays it safe and stuff like that.
Yeah, Young Zaphod had been published originally in a Christmas collection of stories.
True, yeah.
And it had again been published, possibly revised, I'm not sure, in a collection of short stories from multiple authors. Short stories from these authors, otherwise better known, sci-fi universes. The Wizards of Odd, I think that collection was called.
Mm.
And I think it was published again a third time. Yes, it was published a third time in some of the Hitchhiker omnibus collections.
Mm.
So yeah, the Salmon of Doubt would be the fourth, I think, official time that Young Zaphod Plays It Safe was technically published.
So I'm looking forward to reading it because I never read it. It's just sitting on the shelf. And sort of
I read it when it came out, and finding time these days to reread a lot of this stuff that I enjoy and have enjoyed over the years is difficult. Time is difficult.
Indeed.
Not just
lunchtime. Doubly so. It's nearly lunchtime.
Lunchtime
here,
doubly
actually.
so, but
We've been talking
not
so
just
long. Oh god, I'm sorry.
Yeah, hi, I'm back.
Oh, that's cool. We've just been talking
Awesome.
about. You missed most of it, but don't worry.
I know.
So we were just about to talk about the Hitchhikers movie in 2005. So Douglas has already died, I'm afraid, while you were away. I'm sorry. Well, it happened before we even started the podcast, but anyway. Yeah, so the Hitchhikers movie was pitched for decades, various different screenplays, and Douglas rejected all the ones that came to his desk, especially in the 80s. There was a really bad one, apparently. He said it would have been just the worst thing he ever put his name to if he'd agreed to it. And there are a couple of different directors all went through, but in the end, I think, was it Garth Jennings who they went for in the end? Some guy who had never done a film before. It was his first time director. And so this went into production. It was produced for a few years, and it was eventually completed in 2005, 4 years after Douglas passed away. And it sadly had a kind of a mixed reception. What did you guys make of it? Because obviously this is a Dirk podcast, so we won't get to talk about Hitchhikers that much, so we may as well do it here.
Personally, I really liked the movie, and it helps to not be pissed at the Zaphod design when you look at the fact that they intentionally made it like that to piss off the readers, because that's how they did it, and it was a genius marketing strategy, actually. They never, in any promotional material, showed Zaphod's second head or third arm.
Yeah, I think most people, because the BBC TV series, the sort of most expensive animatronic in BBC history, that just sort of sits there, says one line, tells it to shut up, and then that's kind of it. And most people sort of got attached with it. It's sort of a little bit like Doctor Who, where there's a sort of bad production value, or not very good production values, and it sort of has its own kind of charm in a way. And I think maybe that was what played, where the head sort of pops out underneath Sam Rockwell's other head, and
yeah, and like that though. I mean, just imagine if you've read the books, seeing all this promotional material and going into the movie thinking they even fucked up one of the main characters, and then the second head pops out, and you're like, you know what? That's not all that bad.
I quite like the handling of Zaphod's second head. I didn't like the handling of Zaphod as a character himself. So
I can agree with that. I can agree with that.
Yeah. My feeling of the movie was I basically enjoyed it, but it felt further removed from the rest of the style of Hitchhikers, which is all a bit vague because they're all a bit different from each other anyway. But yeah, it felt more removed than those others. So
I like the song.
Yeah,
the song was good.
Yeah, the song was fantastic. Absolutely. But yeah, I remember leaving the cinema with friends, and we didn't hate it, but we weren't enthused by it either. We kind of left the cinema. Well, that was fun, and then talked about other things. We didn't talk about how much we hated it and disliked it and what was wrong with it, but neither did we.
It wasn't exactly the Phantom Menace, was it?
Yeah, no.
I like the little Adams cameo in the end.
Yeah. There were lots of really nice, tiny touches. But
isn't Simon Jones from the BBC series who played Harvey plays one of the security systems on Macrofera or something?
Yeah, the hologram. Yeah.
And I don't know, I'm not sure what I thought of it. I met a friend once who was talking about it, and he said, wow, isn't it really good, the opening, all the way up until after they teleport onto the ship. Everything that happens after that is sort of a lot worse than everything. Everything after that is sort of not very interesting. It's got a great beginning and a great sort of hook, but then the rest of the story is a bit kind of.
I will. That reminds me, the actual Vogon destruction of the Earth. That scene was glorious. I loved it. Just this ship. Pan out. More ships. Just pan out. And just the music keeps building and building and building, and then there's just this tiny puff of a sound, and it's gone, and you move on. There isn't this amazing explosion.
The thing that I really liked they included was the almost like wireframe that the ships made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that was nice.
Yeah, what was I going to say? because there's a lot of opinions on this movie. It's sort of like incredibly divisive, and we could probably talk about it all day. But I remember my brother watched it, and he had some interesting kind of reactions to it. You know, I think going into it, I think a lot of people felt that Moe's death was a really bad choice for Ford, but I actually think he does really well in that.
He did a good Ford. I had no complaints with him.
I think some of the actors in it are a little bit miscast. I think Martin Freeman's a good choice for Arthur, but I feel like this is during the time where he was on The Office, and it's before he really became fully established as the everyman sort of actor. You know, Bilbo Baggins. Who else did he play? In BBC, he played Dr. Watson in the Sherlock reboot that was written by Stephen Moffat. It was awful. Well, okay, not completely irredeemable, but he's good in it.
I quite enjoyed that Sherlock, though it peaked very early on.
It's sort of a one trick
subsequent
pony
seasons got
for me. It was sort of a one trick pony for me. Like you see it's Moffat's writing style that I didn't really, to be honest. I think the acting in it was pretty solid. But anyway, back to him. So Martin Freeman's a good actor, but I feel like he maybe wasn't directed that well in it. And
personally, the only real grievance that I have with the movie, I feel like Marvin was just, physically speaking, too large.
His head was too large.
Yeah.
I think it's a cool design. Maybe doesn't necessarily suit Marvin though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've still got a cool toy of it on my dad's mantelpiece or something. It's a massive head Marvin, a Vogon or something. Yeah, the Vogon's actually wasn't it sort of so was it Jim Henson Muppet kind of company that did the
yes, Henson Productions did the
that
Vogons.
was it, yeah. Yeah, so there's a sort of interesting mix of CGI and sort of more practical effects in sort of stuff like the Vogons. But yeah, the Vogons are kind of a bit kind of silly in it, a little. But they don't really have they're not really supposed to be that menacing, but I don't know. And the other one I didn't really like was Zooey Deschanel as Trillian. I thought she was a bit we need someone who's geeky and nerdy, so let's just put her in and well known. I don't know. I felt like maybe she's always a character that in Hitchhikers they've struggled to get right, I think, and make interesting. And the fact also that she's like the love interest of Arthur in the movie, and he gets the girl at the end, it's sort of a bit, yeah, that's not really necessary. I think Arthur's sort of supposed to be a bit down on his life, and also sort of it means that sort of if you found the books and you really like the relationship, say, that Arthur has with Fenchurch, then the movie kind of says, well, like, we don't care about that. But you know, that's the thing with adaptations. Go on.
I don't get who that one lady was that was like with Zaphod at the end.
Oh yeah, is it isn't she like one of the sub antagonists that works with the Vogons? And the Vogon beaten. He's like, oh well, you're hot, so you're coming with me, or something like that. So I don't know. It's been a while since I've seen it. One thing that I did like that they changed was how Arthur and Ford meet, which is where they have Ford sort of waving at a car and Arthur sort of saves it. Because I like that. That seems sort of believable.
Tries to shake hands with the car. It's a great idea.
that seems to misunderstand the joke of his name a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
It makes it a little bit too blunt and therefore loses the actual joke of it. Though it does explain why Ford and Arthur's friendship is so strong, to the point that when the planet's going to get blown up by the Vogons, the one person that Ford wants to save is Arthur. Because that's never otherwise explained. So I can see why they did it in that sense, even if it made the joke fall flat, but it made the explanation of the rescue, more rounded. So, swings and roundabouts.
Yeah. What I think is also interesting is that Dirk Maggs and Perfectly Normal Productions, who sort of talked about doing more series with Douglas prior to his death, they did 4 more radio series after 2001. And in fact, during 2005, at the same time as the movie, the other radio series. I remember listening to. I don't remember very much what happens, but I do remember listening to it with the family at like dinner table.
Yeah,
And there
the
was
radio
also,
series,
go on.
the tertiary radio series was actually delayed because production had started before the of the radio series before the movie release date was finalized, and then Disney basically got a bit weird about there being a different Hitchhikers coming out at the same time as the movie, and I think that caused a couple of months delay in the radio series coming out before presumably all the lawyers sat down at a table and they were able to thrash out agreements that this radio series, which is an adaptation of the third book and a continuation of a radio series from the late 70s, early 80s, isn't going to impact this movie that's an adaptation of the first book, and really it's just going to help by the name being out there. It's not in competition.
I can see what Disney would have been thinking there, because there's UK's their main market for that movie, let's face it. So
But then again, though, does Disney really need more revenue?
Do they need it? No. Do they want it? Yeah.
Anyway, the other thing is there was a final book, not written by Douglas, of course, but by Owen Colfer, who wrote the Irish writer who wrote the Artemis Fowl series, which is the young adult novels. And apparently Douglas's daughter and his wife were basically big fans of Owen Colfer and read the Artemis Fowl books, and they when he pitched to do a final book, they gave him his blessing, and this eventually came out in 2009. And I've listened to the recent. I don't think I ever read it, but I did listen to the more recent adaptation of it for radio that came out earlier this year in March, I think.
I haven't seen or heard any of the forms of that one.
And Another Thing, which is the only title that's not from the first book in some way. It's actually from the later ones, I think. Which is sort of the reference about.
It was settled after a quote from "So long and thanks for all the fish." I know that.
So I'm the reverse. I read, I'm the reverse. I read the book when it came out, and I started listening to the radio series from earlier this year. But after the first 2 episodes, it was enjoyable, but it didn't grab me that I had to listen to the rest, and I just haven't got around to it yet. I did enjoy it more than what I recall of enjoying the novel. And it's not that I didn't enjoy the novel. I got to the end of it and was like, well, that was basically okay, but it wasn't original Douglas stuff. There were moments.
What I did notice was the radio series put a lot of stuff from the Jem Roberts book, The Frood. There was lots of the appendix stuff, which was all from Douglas's archives. And I noticed some of that, like the line. There's one of the episodes that starts with introduction about the Dentrassi, and it says, "Oh, what a shame that they have absolutely nothing to do with this story," which I was kind of funny. So I thought it was good, but you're right, it wasn't unmissable, and there was sort of, I think the bits of it that suffered were the bits that adapted directly from the novel, and they were sort of, it's that similar thing we talked earlier. I think it was the third one, wasn't it, where it was Cricket Men, and we were talking about how Douglas sort of said that it was difficult because it was originally a Doctor Who script. It was difficult to sort of get Ford, Arthur, and co. to sort of become active participants in sort of saving the universe. They didn't really want to, and that was why he put the Slidey Bartfast character in with the campaign for real time instead of like the campaign for real ale or something like that, which was inspired by.
Well, I mean, like props to him for not letting an idea die.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So the other thing, we go back to, I think we'll go into this in a bit more detail in a future podcast, but there were the Dirk Gently adaptations. There were 2 radio series, each based on the 2 books, with Harry Enfield as Dirk, and a couple of other decent, fairly well-known actors. Olivia Colman is in it as the secretary, and she's very good, and she gets a slightly bigger role than in the books. And they did the 2 books, which are Holistic Detective Agency and Long Dark Tea Time with the Soul. And they were originally going to do an adaptation of Sam and Adele, and they stopped it. I think because some of the same staff worked on the TV series. So because that was they took a year out and worked on the TV series, and they did the pilot in 2010, which was this is a BBC 4 series with Stephen Mangan as Dirk, Darren Boyd as Macduff, and it sort of similar to the books, but it sort of tries to do its own thing. It's a kind of halfway house, which is sort of the odd thing about it. And they did a pilot in 2010, and then they did 3 more in 2012, and then BBC4 basically cut it because they wanted to focus on foreign imported dramas like The Killing and stuff like that from like Norway. And they said, well, there's no point blowing the budget on this show that doesn't get I guess their argument was it doesn't get the viewing figure. It was popular enough that there was like this petition to save it, and sadly it didn't go anywhere. It sounds familiar to you guys, I bet, if you're a fan of
really does.
More recent show as well. But so I liked the BBC TV series for what it was when it originally came out, and like I said, there was not a revival, but almost a reboot of Dirk Gently that was completely different. Although stylistically, a lot of people say it's quite similar to the books in that it's several different plot threads that all come together, whereas the BBC4 series it pretty much exclusively follows Dirk and Macduff's point of view. So both shows got sadly kind of cancelled after essentially 2 seasons, although the Dirk one, the BBC4 ones, it was a mini-series, essentially. And so that's sad, but we might, I think we can talk about it a little bit after, but we might see a sort of revival of Dirk through the comics, because there was a bunch of comics released around about the same time as the BBC America TV show, and had some of the same people involved, as I mentioned earlier.
I do have something of a confession to make, though.
Go on.
I have not finished a single Dirk Gently adaptation yet.
TV or radio adaptation? Or just any of them?
Any.
Okay,
Any
you've only read the books.
I haven't even finished the second book yet.
Oh, no, me neither. I read it like once when I was like 15 or something. I don't remember exactly what happened. I remember roughly. But anyway, we can sort of sum up our thoughts about Douglas Adams. Now we talked about his entire life from start to end, and as much as we can remember. So I think he's definitely one of the most beloved British authors of all time. I think he's always pops up in like the top 10 authors lists and stuff like that. I think the only one that he can sort of compare is another author who's sadly left us more recently, which was Terry Pratchett. I think him and Terry Pratchett for me are on about a similar. There's similarities between them, but I think they're definitely different styles of writing.
Different enthusiasms about writing too. Terry Pratchett loved writing, and
yeah, Terry Pratchett is more fantasy, whereas Douglas is more sci-fi.
Terry Pratchett was also satirized human situations, whereas I think Douglas was a commentator on the human condition, which is similar, but again a little bit different. In the same way that fantasy and sci-fi are both speculative fiction, similar but different. I definitely enjoy both.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the thing about Douglas. I think Michael Bywater has said this quote about him quite early, that the thing that Douglas is very good at is blending the mundane with the fantastical to create bathos, and that's definitely Douglas's style, kind of summed up there.
Yeah, effective anticlimax, and he was able to do that in a comedic way.
I was just wondering, do you feel it's right for people to sort of continue Douglas's work? I mean, obviously adaptations, there's a sort of different thing because they're sort of similar, but they're adding their own kind of thing. Like, for example, the BBC America Dirk Gently series is essentially it's Dirk in name only, and the character is sort of very different, I think, and similar in some ways. There's some carryover in that he's sort of psychic but doesn't want to admit it, and he has this sort of holistic ability that sort of can't really be used to help himself, but uses it to sort of solve cases and stuff. And yeah, there's the bare bones of the character, but as a personality, completely different. And so I was wondering, do you feel it's right for Douglas's work to sort of be continued or riffed on? Because I know a lot of very hardcore Douglas Adams fans who sort of heard about the BBC America series and they were all, it's completely Americanized. I was sort of similar because I had no way of watching it at first, so I was sort of a bit resentful of that more than anything. But I was I'm worried it was a bit Americanized. It's going to be completely against the spirit of what Douglas originally wrote, and yada yada. But what do you guys think? I don't feel that way anymore, by the way. It was just my initial gut reaction.
To be fair, my initial gut.
Sorry,
was
rambling
pretty similar.
question.
My initial gut reaction was pretty similar. I was definitely concerned about the BBC America version of Dirk being Americanized. But then it turned out to, once I watched it, and it took a little bit of getting over that it's not an adaptation of the Douglas Adams novels. It's taking the basic concept of a character called Dirk who believes in the fundamental interconnectedness of all things and has some skills in that area. And it takes that idea and runs with it, and it runs with it well, and I really enjoyed it. I liked it.
It never felt weighted down a lot. The BBC 4 one felt a lot more weighted down by the history to me, which is kind of understandable given that it's in the UK and it's more geared towards a UK audience that's familiar with the books.
Yeah, that's true. And I think part of if they tried to continue the BBC series style, that would have been a problem. And to take it back to Hitchhikers, there was Owen Colfer's sixth book. I feel like if there was another Hitchhikers book written, I wouldn't want it to be a sequel to Owen Colfer's book, because then you're getting two novels away from Douglas's original. What I would prefer would be a parallel sixth.
You mean sort of like what they did with the BBC America Dirk Gently adaptation?
Yeah,
where it's a sort of alternate universe.
It's an alternate
retelling.
Yeah. Another example of the same is the Red Dwarf novels. They were the first two, and then the Grant and Naylor, I can't remember their full names, as the writing team that had written the TV series up to that point and the two novels to that point together, had a falling out, and they each independently wrote their own third novel as a sequel to the first two. So if there was going to be another book written, I would want it to see it as a sequel to the 5 that Douglas wrote, and it wouldn't replace Owen Colfer's sixth. It would just be, an alternate sixth. And if there was a third alternate sixth or a fourth alternate sixth, I think that would be quite neat and would tie in with the multiverse nature of the Hitchhikers that was an intrinsic part of Mostly Harmless.
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
I do really like the concept of not really having the intertwined everything.
But everything's connected.
Yes. The BBC America show is actually what got me into Dirk Gently. It sounded kind of good, and I was like, why not? And then the first thing I noticed when the title sequence plays is based on the novels by Douglas Adams, and I'm like, are you kidding me? He is just everywhere now.
Yeah, I think. But just to respond to what you said, I think it's great that BBC America show sort of tried to introduce it to a new kind of audience, because I think the books definitely there's that element of they're products of their time a little bit. They're products of sort of Douglas's kind of experience, especially the Macduff character, and I think the London setting. It's sort of a little bit 70s, and there's sort of stuff about Apple in the 80s and stuff. And maybe that I think maybe people might. I didn't find that particularly alien when I watched it, but I can definitely imagine an American audience that's maybe not familiar with any of it and sort of a bit kind of confused or a lot of feeling that the book's a bit dated and maybe enjoying the BBC America series a lot more. But I still think that if you can look past that, the book's good. Yeah.
There's this one review that I remember reading for the 5th Hitchhiker book that I think applies way more to the Dirk Gently book, the first one. And that's the plot seems to go everywhere and nowhere all at once.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
And then everything just falls right into place, like tumblers in a lock.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you said there. What else? I was just looking through the notes because a lot of the stuff I've written is stuff we've already mentioned at one point. There's Towel Day. Towel Day is held on 25th of May each year in Douglas on a small thing, but I think that's a nice little tribute, not too extravagant.
Well, there's been 3 Laszlo Lyricons. The first 2 were in the 80s, and the third Laszlo Lyricon was only last year or the year before.
quite recent anyway.
Well, what's that called again? Sorry, I don't recognise the name of it.
So Laszlo Luricon was a reference in Hitchhikers to a starship customizer when they're at the restaurant at the end of the universe.
That's it. Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
My memory.
Yeah. So then the con got named after this character, and I think the first two were within a few years of each other. I'm not sure about the first two, but certainly the third was organised by ZZ9, the Hitchhikers.
That's brilliant though, because that's a little bit like a Star Wars convention where it's just called Ewok Con, or named after some minor character. I don't know. Ewok Con would be great. I'd go to that. Okay, so before I did the podcast, me and my mate were just going through a couple of alternative names, and we eventually settled on Electric Monks because obviously it's a sort of iconic thing from the first book. And I'll read through a couple of them just for the benefit of podcast listeners, and maybe if they've got any other ideas about what we should have called the podcast, then they can write in. Although I'm seriously doubt anyone's listening, but hopefully they are. Who knows? It's only a pilot, so it can only grow. It can only get bigger from here.
Nothing's final quite yet.
So the first one was Through the Cat Flap, because cats are sort of key thing in Dirk Gently. In sort of all versions of the story, sort of finds cats and stuff. And there's the thing with Schrodinger's cat as well, called Bernice. Disembodied voices in the sub-ether, because obviously there's like the sub-ether radio is basically the internet in Hitchhikers. And then Dirk Gently, don't talk to me about Dirk Gently, which is just Marvin. Obviously that's probably what Marvin would say. This one was a bit weird. It was, well, that about wraps it up for God then. That's an odd name. That's just because someone would see that and think it's like some kind of atheist podcast, and it's actually... yeah. As for social media, in case you guys ever want to get in contact with us, I am at Edward J. Hunter on Twitter.
I can obviously plug the subreddit r/Douglas Adams.
We also have a WordPress website for this blog, which is where I'm going to put all the episodes in, and that is dirtgentlypodcast.wordpress.com, and the thumbnail, the little icon for it is of a cat looking at its tail.
Yep, I've got a Twitter as well, so where I occasionally tweet my fandom thoughts and reviews, which is at subether, which is SUB_ETHR.
Oh, it's a good thing I didn't pick that for the name of the podcast then. Well, actually, it would have worked maybe because there's brand synergy there. On my Twitter, I mainly talk about motor racing because that's what I'm into. So
I've got several.
Occasionally,
so that's the one that I use for my fandom stuff.
If you go onto, I think, ID8 Media's Twitter account, it's at ID8 USA, and they're the ones are supposedly doing the rumor is from Arvin Deef and David is they're doing a Kickstarter for the comics, which I talked about a bit earlier.
Arvin's Twitter account, just because he does tweet his own interesting stuff about this sometimes, is at ARVD.
So thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Keep believing, believe whatever you want to believe, and we'll believe you. And news is belief. I think is that a good thing? Is that a good motto to end on? I don't know. So let's go with that.
We can have a different one
bye
every
for now.
Bye.
Yeah, see you next time.